Today's sermon marks the conclusion of the sermon series that I didn't know was a sermon series starting out. It all started, as you may recall, on May 29th, and it started not so much with the content of that sermon, but with the well of emotion behind it. After a spate of recent gun violence episodes, one which targeted children at an elementary school again, and another which was intentional racial violence with a white gunman targeting shoppers at a grocery store in an African American community which he expressly chose for its racial demographics. And after those things, I was left with more emotions than words. And I recall my tears and my heartache and my frustration that day far more than I recall the sermon. It was a how can this be sermon. It was a how long can this go on sermon. It was a why aren't we better or even improving sermon. So that became part one. A sermon born of spiritual exhaustion and outrage and despair at the state of the world. And my sense is that I was not alone in feeling any of that day. It got a little better after that. Not the sermon, not the world, but my spiritual state at least. I spent some time limiting my news watching and my social media browsing, and I spent some time praying and reading scripture and other books, and just going around people who love me. And I spent some time walking, and I spent some time staring at the walls. And that gave rise to Sermon Series Part 2. Last week's sermon was entitled Replenishing, and it had to do with rediscovering Sabbath and spiritual self-care when the world presses in, and finding restoration in God. And in that sermon, I promised that this week I would tackle Part 3. After the dryness and despair of spiritual burnout, after the turn away from the world and its worries and the turn towards Sabbath and renewal and healing, well, what comes next? How do we turn back to the world and back to the work and back to the problems which are no closer to solution? Sabbath doesn't fix the world, it fixes us. Racism has not gone away in the last 3 weeks. The risk, no, the likelihood of gun violence is undiminished. Humanity's capacity for inhumanity seems limitless. We remain divided and we're in a world of hurt. So what do we do now? Well, as I prepared that this week, or as I pondered that this week, I came to a conclusion that we must acknowledge. There is no panacea. There is only opposition or contrast. Love in the face of hatred. Truth in the face of falsehood. Light shining in darkness. Forgiveness overcoming resentment and bitterness or sin. Or to put it in theological terms, the kingdom of heaven opposed as it has always been to the kingdom of this world. Existing in the midst of it, already present, not yet complete. And when we think of opposition, we are trained to think of conflict. Like the Avengers, combining their special powers and strength of will, come together to destroy Thanos and his megalomaniac menace to the universe. Or Bilbo Baggins cast the ring of power into Mount Doom, and the towers of Mordor tumble, and the armies of Sauron are defeated, and the reign of Sauron ends. Or Luke Skywalker blows up the Death Star and everybody on it because the Death Star blew up Alderaan and everybody on it. Or Jack Reacher kills every bad guy in town until there are no more bad guys remaining, and good wins whatever it takes. And that's a tempting way to see things. There's a finality to it, and there's a purity to it, And there's a satisfying justice or just desserts to it. But the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus describes it, doesn't really work that way. In John's gospel, we hear it this way instead. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now think about that. The darkness tries to squelch the light, to extinguish the light, to swallow the light, to overpower the light, to overcome the light. And the light, in response, exists undying amid the darkness. Simply is. It does not overpower the darkness or obliterate the darkness, yet by its existence in the world, it changes the darkness. As the light grows and spreads, the darkness is dispelled and diminished and transformed and displaced. So there's a first clue. Maybe our task is just to be what we are, to bear witness to what we believe, simply to lift the light. Better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. A world with light is infinitely better than a world of darkness. Or to think of the work of the kingdom in another way, we might turn to the Gospel of Matthew and the beautiful and simple images or parables for the kingdom that Jesus describes. And some of these are familiar to us, so we have to get past a little bit of, yeah, I know that one, and really think about them. Remember, the word parable is from the Greek parabole, which means to throw alongside or to compare. And Jesus gives us several such comparisons to consider. The kingdom is like a sower who went out to sow or to spread seed. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, but withered away just as quickly in the sun. Some seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. And other seeds fell on good ground and brought forth grain. So now we live with that a minute. And we make a few observations. There are more places than not in the parable where the seed doesn't take root. It's gobbled up, it withers away, it's choked out. 3/4 of the time, the seed doesn't hit its intended target or have its desired effect or produce its desired yield. The sower is unconcerned. The sower simply casts the seed broadly and abundantly and lavishly and lets it take hold where it will. The sower does not pick and choose where the seed is cast, makes no calculations about wasted seed or misspent effort. The sower sows good seed regardless of the soil. And the sower's intent is not focused upon the not crop. It's focused upon the crop. And the emphasis in the parable is the yield of that crop. Some of the seed brings forth 100-fold harvest, some 60, some 30. Now, the New Interpreter's Bible offers this insight. There is some evidence that a harvest of 4 to 10-fold was considered normal, with a harvest of 15 times what was sown being exceptionally good. So a harvest of 30-fold would be twice times exceptionally good, and a harvest of 60-fold would be astonishing upon astonishing, and a harvest of 100-fold would be inconceivable and defying all human expectation. That notion of an outsized result, of an end far bigger than the beginning, is mirrored in the parable of the mustard seed. It starts out smaller than small. But when it's grown, and it isn't fully grown or fully realized yet, but when it is grown, the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. We want to see the result, a kingdom fully realized. God invites us to participate in and, in fact, to be the process. The kingdom arising. And speaking of arising, Jesus' next parable is about bread that's arisen. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. The key to this parable is twofold. There's a hiddenness to the work of the kingdom. You don't see the yeast's activity, you see the result of its activity. You see the rise of the dough, the transformation of the flour. And the second thing is the relentlessness of the kingdom. The baker woman mixes until all of it is leavened, all of it, every last bit, every corner of creation is changed. Well, that's encouraging if we ponder it. The notion of the kingdom's gradual but relentless rise. But until the kingdom comes, what of evil in the world? Because we have despairingly witnessed that there is evil at work in the world. Jesus himself acknowledges it in yet one more parable. Kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field, but while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the householder's servants are dismayed. Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where did these weeds come from? An enemy, unnamed, unknown, has done this, replies the master. It has nothing to do with my desire. It has nothing to do with my intent. It is not for a reason. It is not my doing. It is opposed to what I am doing. Then do you want us to fix it? Ask the servants. Do you want us to sort out the good from the bad, determine which is which, eradicate the bad and preserve the good? And the master replies, no, for in uprooting the weeds, you'd uproot the wheat too. It's a mix of bad and good. Be the good. Trust the harvest. Another way of saying it is, do you think your eye is good enough, discerning enough to know what is wheat and what is bearded darnel? They look deceptively familiar in their early growth. And their roots intertwine. You can't eradicate the darnel without destroying the wheat. When the harvest comes, then separation is possible, but not before. And that's not your job. So in the interim, simply be the good. Now, this parable is not a call merely to be passive in the face of evil, to not combat racism, to not combat gun violence, to not strive against injustice in the world. It's simply a reminder the labor is ours, but the final adjudication is not. Perfection is not attainable on this side of the coming kingdom. We are called to be in the process and to do our bit and to do our part. Paul's observation is helpful. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth. So what's the takeaway from all this? And encouragement, I suggest, to keep lifting our light, sowing our seed, following our call. We're called to be the light, be the yeast, be the good seed or the good soil, and that's it. And that's enough. And there will be times, as 3 weeks ago, when we can only cry out in despair. And there will be a need for ongoing restoration and Sabbath, as we discussed last week. We are not perpetual motion machines. But after the lament and after the Sabbath, after the world weariness and the restoration, we might be encouraged by the words of Paul from Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at harvest time if we do not give up. Or as John Wesley put it, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. Scatter generosity, broadcast forgiveness, sow kindness, throw out fistfuls of gratitude, heedlessly spread compassion, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. The work is sometimes wearying, but the harvest of astonishment will be worth the wait. Amen.